Picture the corridor first. Rome AD 39. The stone breathes with trapped heat. A thin ribbon of incense leaks under a bronze door and tangles with a harsher smell you cannot name the iron taste that sits behind the tongue when fear has been in a room too long. Oil flames blink in hammered sconces and make the walls seem to ripple so that marble becomes water and water a mirror. Sandals whisper. Silk skims stone. The great men of the empire, men who write laws with a nod and end careers with a shrug, pull their togas tighter as if cloth could defend the soul. Laughter travels down the passageway, bright and brittle, the kind of laughter that never touches the eyes. It is followed by silence so sudden it feels like a hand on the mouth. Before we go farther, a warning. What unfolds inside these gilded rooms is not merely the excess of a spoiled prince or the gossip of hostile commentators. It will take us through scenes of sexual coercion, ritualized humiliation, and the manipulation of intimacy as an instrument of rule. We will name what ancient authors only dared suggest. If you need to step back, do. We can only treat this honestly or not at all. Now step forward with us, not as voyeurs, but as witnesses tracing a pattern. The emperor is Gaius Julius Caesar. Rome called him Caligula. Little Boot the camp child who became a god. It is tempting to file him under madness to imagine a mind cracked like a mask, dropped on marble. But madness alone is too simple, too comforting. What matters here is method, how craving and cruelty once harnessed to absolute authority become a system. Call it the politics of the bedchamber. Call it a government of the body. In this place, desire is not private and love is never safe. Sex staged and weaponized becomes a language the state speaks fluently. Listen again to that laughter. You will hear it many times in the coming hours at banquets where wives are appraised like war horses, in chambers where tears are measured, where a woman's refusal becomes a cue for spectacle, in temples where offerings smell of myrrh and something fouler because worship has been made to kneel next to shame. But this series is not only about the emperor's appetites. It is about the machinery that amplified them, the courtiers who learned to read his face like a weather sign, the senate that discovered silence could be a survival skill, the priests who learned new liturgies that bent the gods into court officials. A single will is terrible enough. A single will armed with institutions is a calamity with archives. We begin at the threshold for a reason. Always tell truth that thrones hide. Here the empire teaches you how to behave. Do not meet the wrong eyes. Do not linger near the wrong door. Here a prefect pauses with his hand on a curtain and thinks of the daughter he has not allowed out in days. Here a secretary steels himself to carry a message that may turn a home into a courtroom. Here servants move like shadows, essential invisible, and the only ones who could draw the palace from memory. It is not only the emperor who shapes this space, it is the many who learn to serve him by anticipating harm, by perfecting the art of not seeing. If you have been told that Rome was a city of law, you have not been lied to. But law bends around an emperor like the laurel bends to a brow. There are statutes for marriage, fines for infidelity, formulas for mourning. There are oaths sworn in the names of gods whose statues look down on proceedings. Yet within these corridors, law becomes a prop. Dignity, what the Romans called dignitas, is a currency that can be devalued overnight. Pudicitia, a woman's public honour, can be turned to ash with a gesture from a dais. And where dignity fails, policy thrives. Humiliation is not an accident here. It is a message, a demonstration piece. Watch what I can do to the one thing you thought was yours, your household, your body, your love. A word about sources, because honesty is the spine of any dissent. Much of what you will hear comes from writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, men fascinated and repelled by power in equal measure. They wrote decades later, weaving court talk into moral history seasoning, fact with rumour, letting witnesses speak through the veil of time. We will hold their pages up to the light and we will ask what rings true, because it matches other patterns, what serves a hostile agenda, what, though perhaps exaggerated, reveals the kind of thing only a particular system could produce. We will not sensationalize, but we will not flinch. So why tell this now? Because the story that waits behind those doors is older than Rome and younger than this morning's news. It is the story of what happens when the private is nationalized, when the bed becomes a ministry, when the most intimate acts are stripped of their humanity and remade as performance for a watching court. It is about how a crowd learns to clap for things it would once have fled, and how institutions, Temples, tribunals, guard rooms are recruited into protecting the stage on which harm repeats until it looks like custom. This is not merely one man's depravity, but the way power finds its deepest pleasures when it can make others complicit. Imagine the Watchers. A senator's wife, face fresh with hope and powder, studies the play of light on the emperor's rings and understands before he speaks that her name has been chosen by the room. A father bows low and memorizes the floor veins while his heart learns a new rhythm that sounds like the drums from the amphitheatre. A sister wears jewellery heavy enough to bruise because a nation has been ordered to call her a goddess, and gods in Rome are as useful as they are adored. In these moments, policy is not written, it is enacted. The law is not read, it is performed. The promise of this series is simple. We will follow the laughter to its source and map the city it built from public spectacle in the Circus Maximus, where honour bleeds into entertainment, to the banquet where words turn into knives, to the family wing of the palace redesigned like a body with no skin, to the administrative rooms no poet describes where ink dries on orders that make cruelty efficient. We will watch how a single theatrical mind turned Rome's habits against itself, how the cult of the emperor became a cloak for violations, how the language of piety decorated the rooms where consent was impossible, how clever men learned to pretend that being present was the same as being powerless. We will also meet those who adapted. Not everyone breaks the same way. Some learn to bargain with the monster to trade influence for a slower destruction. Some learn to look down from the balcony with a face sculpted into neutrality while their hands shook behind the balustrade. Some learn to calculate to bide their time to survive long enough to pass along a technique of living, how to answer a summons with neither refusal nor consent, how to twist a ritual into a refuge, how to file the memory to a razor's edge and wait. Do not lose sight of scale. The empire is larger than the palace. Provinces breathe according to the pressure at Rome's throat. A decree in a chamber means a household is ruined in Antioch, a festival is rearranged in Alexandria, a garrison in Germania discovers that a commander's wife will not be attending the summer rites. In the kitchens below us, fish still sizzle, and a boy with burned fingers hums a hymn to Isis because the melody helps him move faster. In a scriptorium, a tired clerk sharpens a pen and wonders why the requisitions for torches have tripled. Power is not only thunder, it is the low hum that never stops. What then are we after? Not a catalogue of horrors, though there will be horror but the anatomy of a system. How spectacle conditions sympathy. How laughter can be trained to arrive at the wrong time. How a state learns to borrow the language of the sacred to excuse the profane. How men who consider themselves good become instruments, and how women who understand the rules too well sometimes learn to use them and sometimes disappear beneath them. We will look for the moments when choice still existed, even if narrow as a blade. The corridor grows brighter as we approach the door. The guards do not look at you, that is their last mercy. You will hear music tuned to please one man. You will smell perfume chosen to erase thought. And you will feel the polity itself holding its breath, because in a world where one will is law, the beating of that heart becomes weather. Some will say the emperor is sick. Others will say he is possessed by gods. We will say this: a person is dangerous. A person armed with a scaffold of obedience is catastrophic. And what destroys most thoroughly is not the scream, but the shrug. When we step through, we will not be surprised to find that the room is a stage. Curtains arranged to frame one body and expose others, couches placed so that witnesses cannot avoid each other's eyes, statues positioned like judges who never tire. It is theatre and it is administration. The liberty to harm has been organised, staffed, rehearsed and bound to reward. Rome, mistress of systems, has discovered a new application for its genius. Walk with us then from the corridor to the chamber, from the chamber to the circus, from the circus to the files where clerks record the names of those who will not speak. Hold fast to the knowledge that stories told clearly can be a kind of refusal. History cannot heal the past, but it can teach the living how systems are built and how sometimes they are broken. This is the price of looking. We cannot unknow what we learn. We can only decide what to do with it. Welcome to the study of a sovereign who made intimacy a weapon and humiliation a ritual. Welcome to a reign where the private life of the palace became the common policy of an empire. We will descend carefully, naming what the marble would prefer you not to hear. And when we return to this corridor at the end, we will ask whether what we found was a monster or a mirror. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now, softly tell me, where are you listening from? Picture this, the year is AD 15. The Rhine frontier is a place where childhood does not mean lullabies, but the clash of iron on wood, the stink of horses, and the chants of legionaries as steady as the beat of a war drum. Somewhere among the lines of tents, goat hide and leather stretched tight against the northern wind, a small child stumbles on legs still too short for a soldier's stride. His name is Gaius, son of Germanicus and Agrippina, but the soldiers who adore him have another name. They watch the boy shuffle through mud wearing miniature sandals made just for him, Caligula, and they laugh in affection. Caligula they call Little Boot. The nickname will cling to him longer than love ever did. Germanicus is more than a father. He is Rome's golden general, a man whose name conjures loyalty even in weary troops. To the men he commands, Germanicus is destiny made flesh. To his son he is simply a figure whose armour glitters like the sun, whose voice can halt chaos, whose smile can make even the harshest march feel like triumph. The camp adores Germanicus so deeply that they extend that reverence to his child. They hoist the boy onto shoulders spattered with blood, balance him on shields, and let him play at command with wooden swords. He is not merely tolerated, he is a talisman, a promise that Rome's greatness has heirs. But what does it mean to be raised where cruelty is routine? Developmental psychology tells us that children absorb the environment's moral cues, like water soaking through linen. What they see applauded, they understand as right. When a cohort erupts in cheers as prisoners are paraded before them, a child does not pass legality. He learns that humiliation is spectacle. When soldiers jest about death over bowls of barley porridge, a boy hears not tragedy but comedy. Violence is not a shadow here. It is the rhythm of daily life, a lullaby sung in screams and smoke. Think of the rituals of the camp, the mock battles staged for training where men slash at each other with dulled blades to sharpen reflex and spirit. The boy watches these drills not as grim duty, but as entertainment. For the legionaries, bruises are proof of valour. For the child, they are lessons. Consider too the public punishments. A deserter flogged until he collapses, a thief stoned by his peers. These are not hidden in alleys. They are staged in the open, meant to sculpt obedience through fear. And the boy perched on a soldier's knee sees discipline equated with pain. When cruelty is applause, mercy begins to look like weakness. Roman frontier culture was itself a theatre of hardness. The Germanic forests pressed in like a living enemy. The rivers marked both lifeline and threat. Soldiers filled their evenings with gambling, drinking, and bawdy songs about gods who conquered by force. They were a society built on the expectation that life is short and victory is survival. In such a setting, the distinction between play and brutality blurred easily. A child's laugh might echo the same cadence as the roar after a battlefield triumph. The boy named Little Boot grew up clapping for the same rhythms. Modern studies of trauma and normalization show us how fragile the moral compass of a child can be when calibrated by violence. Some become withdrawn, unable to imagine safe bonds. Others absorb aggression as language, as the default grammar of human contact. For Caligula, surrounded by men who cheered as fire-consumed villages, and who sang of slaughter as a mark of glory, the lessons must have sunk deep. Pain was not random, it was organized, celebrated, codified as the heartbeat of empire. And he, mascot of the legions, was taught to grin along. We must imagine the dissonance. Germanicus himself, though beloved, was part of the machine. He embodied Roman virtue, virtus, the strength of manhood proven in war. He taught loyalty, honour, duty. But alongside that nobility, his son saw the darker truth that Rome's nobility was purchased with the humiliation of enemies, that victory and cruelty were bedfellows. In the eyes of a child, the contradictions collapse. The adored father and the blood-soaked general are the same figure. And if the father is good, then what he does must be good as well. Here lies the seed. When admiration fuses with brutality, the soul learns to bless harm as destiny. The soldiers, of course, thought they were gifting the boy joy. They sewed his tiny uniform, carved him toys shaped like spears, made him a living emblem of their camaraderie. They never asked what it meant to make a child the mascot of war. They never wondered how a mind still pliant as wax would harden around the grooves they carved with cheer and blood. In their laughter, they sowed the idea that to rule is to command fear, to be adored is to wield terror, and to belong is to join the game of domination. We do not say that Caligula was destined to be a monster. History resists that kind of fatalism. But it is fair to ask, what does a child learn when cruelty is applause, when a nickname born of love masks a childhood steeped in violence, when the lullabies of infancy are chants of men who kill for a living. Rome adored its little boot, but in doing so it laced him into sandals that would leave bloody prints across the empire. Picture the scene in Antioch, Syria, AD 19. Germanicus, the Golden General. Rome's brightest hope lies wasting away in his chamber. The man whose presence once electrified legions now breathes in ragged gasps, his body betraying him, while whispers ripple through the empire. Poison, some say. Treachery, others insist. The official verdict is illness, but no one in Rome believes that entirely. Germanicus himself, before dying, accused the governor Piso of foul play, hinting at orders whispered from higher still. The suspicion spread like fire through dry fields. Had Emperor Tiberius, his adoptive father, orchestrated the death of his own heir? For young Gaius Caligula, the moment was not simply a family tragedy. It was a fracture in the world he thought secure. He had known his father as invincible, adored by armies and citizens alike, the man who embodied Rome's noblest ideals. To see that man destroyed not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of intrigue, revealed to the child that power's true battlefield was not the field at all. It was the palace where poison and rumour could do what swords could not. Agrippina the Elder. Germanicus's widow became a living vessel of grief transmuted into paranoia. Once dignified and strong, she now walked with eyes sharp and restless, convinced that spies lurked in every corridor. She believed, perhaps rightly, that Tiberius wanted her children extinguished to protect his own succession. For the little boy by her side, this transformation was formative. A mother who once offered warmth now whispered suspicion into his ears. Every gift from the court was suspect, every smile a mask, every banquet a potential trap. Imagine the palace through a child's eyes in these years, a place where whispers carried more weight than oaths, where a misplaced word could unravel a family. Tiberius had perfected the climate of delatio, informers eager to denounce their neighbours, courtiers trading accusations for favour. Trials for treason majestas multiplied, some sparked by as little as a jest or a careless toast. Executions followed, and with them the spectacle of senators forced to vote against their own kin. This was the classroom in which Caligula was raised. Children learned the grammar to make sense of language. Gaius was learning the grammar of betrayal to make sense of power. He saw his mother battle against the emperor in veiled gestures, refusing invitations, surrounding herself with loyalists teaching her children to measure every word. He saw brothers' exiled family names, blackened friends disappear without explanation. And he saw survival hinge not on truth but on silence. In a world where amicitiae, friendship, was supposed to be Rome's highest bond, he watched loyalty turn into a bargaining chip. Germanicus's death left more than a household in mourning. It left a vacuum. The empire had loved him as a potential successor, a man of charisma and battlefield glory. His absence shifted the balance of succession back to Tiberius's bloodline, favouring men like Drusus, and later even Sejanus, the praetorian prefect, who became infamous for manipulating imperial succession. For the young Caligula, this meant that he and his siblings lived as both wards of Rome's future and as potential threats to the ruling emperor. The paradox was suffocating, adored as symbols, yet endangered as rivals. Agrippina's grief sharpened into defiance. She clashed openly with Tiberius, accusing him in public gestures of orchestrating her husband's murder. This turned the family into a dangerous spectacle. For Caligula, the lesson was stark truth spoken aloud is deadly. Survival lies in the mask. And so he watched carefully. He learned to smile when others seethed to appear compliant while recording each slight. He was becoming a student of duplicity in a palace where duplicity was the only tongue spoken fluently. Germanicus had taught his son how to wear the boots of a soldier. Agrippina, in her paranoid mourning, taught him how to wear the mask of suspicion. Together, these lessons fused into the boy's worldview. The world is treachery, trust is a trap, and affection is a weapon wielded by those who smile closest. It is tempting to imagine childhood as a time of innocence, but Caligula's was nothing of the sort. His toys were wooden swords, his bedtime stories the rumours of poison. His family table was littered with accusations. The death of his golden father did not just remove a protector, it baptized the child into Rome's most enduring truth that in a palace of marble betrayal is the first language learned and the only one remembered. Picture Capri AD 31. To the outsider, it is paradise an island painted with turquoise seas and cliffs that plunge like marble columns into the waves. But for those summoned there, paradise is a mask. Behind its bright horizon, the island was a theatre of shadows, and its stage director was the aging Emperor Tiberius. Here, the ruler of the Roman world withdrew from the capital, surrounding himself with astrologers, informers, and pleasures that, if we trust the sources, warped into something darker than decadence. This is where the teenage Caligula was sent, plucked from a household haunted by suspicion, and delivered to the private court of his great-uncle. The boy was not yet 20. What he found would mark him for life. Ancient writers do not agree on what Capri truly was. Suetonius, a biographer who delighted in scandal, describes a palace where children were trained as little fishes, taught to swim between the emperor's thighs for his amusement. He records rooms decorated for unspeakable acts and guests reduced from senators to broken shells. Tacitus, more austere, less prone to salacious detail, sketches only the corruption of a court suffocated by fear and accusation, hinting at vices, but leaving blanks where certainty falters. Cassius Dio, writing later, weaves both rumour and moral judgment into his narrative. Modern historians caution us much of this may be exaggeration. Political poison spilled after Tiberius's death. Yet even exaggerations reveal a truth about what people believed power could permit. Whether or not every story is literal, Capri was remembered as the place where governance and obscenity blurred. Into this crucible stepped Caligula. How does a boy survive among predators? By becoming fluent in masks. Suetonius tells us he wore a face of courtesy so polished that Tiberius himself never suspected the hatred coiling underneath. He laughed at the emperor's jokes, obeyed every command, mirrored the old man's moods with perfect timing. Behind the mask, he was watching, cataloguing. Every humiliation inflicted on another taught him something. Every tremble of a courtier's hand, every forced laugh became data in his private study of fear. It is here in Capri's halls that Gaius learned the lesson that would define him. Absolute power means absolute license. Tiberius embodied it. If a whim demanded pain, it was law. If suspicion flickered, lives ended. And yet, unlike many youths crushed by such exposure, Caligula did not collapse. He adapted. He learned to inhale the atmosphere of cruelty without choking. The mask became second skin. Consider the psychology of it. Modern research on children exposed to abusive environments shows a spectrum of responses. Some internalize the fear, becoming cautious, withdrawn. Others mimic the abuser, crafting safety through imitation. Caligula unusually did both. He copied submission outwardly while inwardly cultivating the abuser's toolkit. He was not merely enduring, he was apprenticing. Each grotesque spectacle became a seminar in control: how humiliation breaks a person faster than pain, how secrecy amplifies terror, how desire once distorted can be turned into a leash. By the time Tiberius approached death, the boy had become a man no longer startled by cruelty. He was fluent in duplicity, able to hide storms behind still water. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, whether by natural illness or by quiet suffocation, as rumour insisted, Caligula emerged not as a victim, but as a survivor shaped into steel. The island had not broken him. It had refined him. The Romans would celebrate their new emperor, believing that the sunny charm he displayed in public was the true man at last freed from Tiberius's shadow. But they did not see what Capri had crafted. They mistook the mask for the face. What they had crowned was not innocence restored, but a student of license, a man who had learned that cruelty, if dressed as policy, could command not only obedience but applause. Capri was paradise only in appearance. In reality, it was Rome's most perverse classroom, and its brightest pupil was Caligula, who had mastered both sides of survival: how to bow and how to remember every humiliation, storing it like kindling for the day he would light the empire with the fire of what he had learned. Picture Rome in the spring of AD 37. The city, weary from Tiberius's long suspicious reign, seems to inhale for the first time in years. When news arrives that Gaius Caligula has been proclaimed emperor, crowds pour into the streets. Bells toll, sacrifices, smoke on altars, and garlands drip from doorways. The memory of Germanicus still glows in Roman hearts, and to them his son is not just a ruler, but a promise. Where Tiberius withdrew, Caligula embraces. Where the old emperor sulked and cowed, the young man strides into the forum with open arms. His first gestures are dazzling in their generosity. Amnesties flow like wine, prisoners are released exiles. Recalled, the shadow of treason trials briefly lifted. Debts are remitted. The treasury opens its coffers to shower bonuses on the Praetorian Guard and gifts upon the people. He hosts lavish games, spectacles brighter than Rome had seen in a generation. Chariots thunder, gladiators clash, exotic animals roar in arenas draped with silk. For a moment it feels as though the Republic's long nightmare has cracked and dawn has finally arrived. Citizens line the streets not in sullen obedience but in jubilation, shouting his name. Senators too breathe easier. For years they had walked like men on glass, one whisper away from accusation under Tiberius. Now they are consulted, honoured in public ceremonies, treated as partners rather than suspects. Even the army rejoices their new commander distributes donatives with the easy hand of a man who knows the price of loyalty. Caligula appears to embody the virtues of his father: charm, charisma, an instinct for popularity. The empire feels reborn, and for a few months, hope is not dangerous. And then suddenly he collapses. Ancient sources tell us that within the first year of his reign, Caligula was struck by a violent illness that nearly killed him. Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe a fever so intense that Rome feared their new emperor would die before his promise had even begun. What precisely afflicted him is unknowable. Some modern scholars speculate encephalitis perhaps, or temporal lobe epilepsy conditions that can inflame the brain and leave lingering changes in mood, impulse, even personality. Others argue it was simply a grave but ordinary infection exaggerated by rumour. What matters is not the diagnosis, but the aftermath. Caligula survived, but those who saw him before and after whispered that something fundamental had shifted. The laughter that once carried warmth grew edged. The eyes that once charmed seemed now to watch with predatory stillness. Rome still, dizzy with relief, did not yet understand what had happened. But like a curtain tearing in two, the line between benevolence and cruelty had thinned. This is not to say that the illness created the monster. Trauma apprenticeship in Capri, the inheritance of suspicion, these were already baked into him. Yet illness may have acted as catalyst, like heat-striking metal already primed for fracture. He had tasted adoration absolute and intoxicating. He had felt mortality brush his shoulder. Together, these two experiences fermented into something volatile, a ruler determined not just to be obeyed, but to test the limits of obedience. The mercy of his first months was genuine enough, or at least useful. It was sugar soothing a people starved of kindness. But sugar also conceals bitterness. Behind the festivals and largesse, Caligula was learning how pliable Rome could be when offered gifts. He saw how quickly senators forgot their dignity when praised, how easily citizens mistook generosity for love. Power, he realized, was not only taken by force, it could be won through seduction, through the appearance of grace, and then twisted into something else. For now the city still celebrated, blind to the storm massing behind the mask. In AD 37, Rome thought it had found a saviour. In truth, it had crowned a man who had already begun to wonder what new pleasures could be purchased with their applause. The dawn looked like mercy, but the sun was rising on something far more dangerous. Picture Rome only months after the euphoria of AD 37. The garlands have wilted, the games are over, and the palace has grown quiet in a way that unnerves even seasoned servants. Whispers begin to run through marble corridors, orders that make no sense. Appointments given and rescinded in the same hour, eyes in a 19-year-old emperor that seem far older than his years, eyes that look through people rather than at them. Those closest to Caligula begin to wonder whether the fever had not just scarred his body, but unlocked something already coiled deep within. It is in the private chambers that the change becomes most visible. For centuries, Rome's elite had indulged in sexual libertinism. Affairs between senators and matrons, liaisons with slaves, the occasional dalliance at a banquet, these were not secrets but part of aristocratic culture. What mattered was discretion, the maintenance of pudicitia, that delicate balance between appetite and honour. Public virtue was to be preserved even if private vices thrived. A man might joke about his affairs over wine, but he did not flaunt his conquest of another senator's wife in the Senate House. Caligula ignored these limits. His debauchery was not hidden, and it was not simply about pleasure, it was about humiliation. He would summon noble wives into his chambers in full view of their husbands, declaring his intentions with a smile that dared anyone to object. He began to treat the marriage bed as a political instrument, a place where loyalty was tested not through oaths, but through the forced complicity of the ruling class. To refuse was to risk death. To consent was to live in shame. The bed became his laboratory not just for sexual satisfaction, but for experiments in power. Servants told of banquets where the emperor, flushed with wine, would rise from his couch and point to a senator's wife as if selecting livestock at market. "She will dine with me later," he would announce, and the room would hold its breath. Husbands were expected to nod to feign gratitude even as humiliation scorched their faces. The spectacle was deliberate. In a society where a household's honour was the foundation of political power, such public desecration was not just cruelty, it was policy. Caligula was sending a message nothing in Rome, not even the sanctity of a senator's marriage bed, was beyond his reach. The whispers spread quickly. Palace servants reported that the emperor's chambers were not filled with the usual sighs and laughter of indulgence, but with something stranger cries that carried a different pitch, as though experiments were being conducted behind the curtains. Women emerged, pale, not only violated, but altered, as if the encounter had stripped away some essential layer of dignity. Caligula seemed to observe his victims as much as he touched them, studying reactions with a clinical detachment that disturbed even the hardened slaves who had seen everything. It was as though he wanted to measure precisely how humiliation broke a person. Here lies the crossing point. Other emperors had lovers, favourites, courtesans. Rome tolerated that. Caligula weaponized sex itself, turning it from private indulgence into public demonstration. He transformed the erotic into a theatre of subjugation, forcing senators to laugh while their wives were degraded and compelling noblewomen to carry the weight of political messages inscribed on their bodies. The Romans had always known that emperors could take lives. Caligula taught them that he could also take dignity, honour and intimacy, and that survival would mean learning to applaud the theft. The marble had begun to crack. The boy who once charmed with mercy was now testing Rome with humiliation, and the ruling class, forced into complicit silence, was learning that the empire's throne was not only a seat of law and command. It had become a stage where private vice was rewritten as public policy, and where the bed itself had been transformed into the most dangerous office in Rome. Picture a banquet in the Palatine Palace AD 38. The couches are draped in Tyrian purple goblets heavy with Syrian glass tables, sagging under roasted peacocks and honeyed dormice. Senators recline stiffly, more anxious than hungry, while their wives and daughters sit like ornaments arranged for display. The air hums with flutes and murmurs, but beneath it lies a silence as taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Caligula rises. Wine in hand, he strolls among the guests, pausing at each woman, as though at market. His gaze lingers, calculating. With a voice loud enough for all to hear, he begins his catalogue. This one's hips are too narrow, that one's breasts too small, another's face only tolerable in candlelight. He laughs, and the court must laugh with him. Then comes the declaration he will take one of them later to his bed. Her husband, seated nearby, is expected to nod to thank the emperor for such an honour, even as his jaw tightens with rage and his knuckles blanch on the wine cup. In Rome, this was more than personal insult. It was the deliberate shattering of a household's dignity. The Romans had a word for the virtue of women pudicitia. It meant chastity, yes, but also the visible modesty that reflected honour onto the entire household. A senator's wife was not only a companion, she was a vessel of reputation. When her dignity was mocked, the husband's dignitas, his standing, suffered. When her chastity was seized, the family's farmer, its public name, crumbled. For Caligula, this was the point. He was not simply indulging desire. He was plundering the currency of Rome's elite. Every man in that room knew what was at stake. To object would be to defy the emperor's will, treason in all but name. To remain silent was to become complicit in one's own humiliation. And so the choreography of complicity unfolded. Husbands forced to smile, women bowed their heads. Senators murmured thanks for the emperor's generosity. The silence was not empty. It was full of calculation, speak and die or suffer and live. This ritualized degradation was no accident. It was a performance staged with precision. Caligula understood that Rome's ruling class lived and died by reputation. He weaponized that knowledge, turning banquets into theatres of shame. Every insult delivered before witnesses magnified the wound. Every nod of forced approval confirmed that even the proudest senators would barter honour for survival. Why did no one speak? Because in that room words were blades. A protest would cut only one way against the speaker's throat. Every senator had seen men condemned for less dragged from curule chairs to execution for an unguarded remark. Under Tiberius they had learned the danger of whispers. Under Caligula they learned the danger of silence, that it could be demanded, stretched and twisted into assent. For the women the insult was double. They bore the physical violation, but also the knowledge that their suffering was currency spent against their own households. To resist was to endanger their children, their fathers, their brothers. To yield was to live as a wound carried in silence. Some prayed the emperor's gaze would pass them over. Others prayed he would choose them quickly, sparing their families further humiliation. In such calculations, virtue itself became hostage. The banquets of shame were not indulgent accidents of appetite. They were demonstrations repeated often enough that the message burned itself into the marble. No rank, no family, no virtue was beyond the emperor's reach. What Rome had once cherished as the fabric of social life on a pudicitia fama was unravelled with a smile and a cup of wine. And as the laughter forced itself through dry throats, Rome learned a new rule. Survival required not only sonance but performance, the theatre of gratitude in the face of degradation. The couches gleamed, the goblets clinked, the torches flared, but beneath the luxury a darker truth pulsed. The empire's banquets had become laboratories of power, where humiliation was served as the main course, and complicity was the only wine poured for every guest. Picture the palace doors closing at the end of one of those banquets. The laughter fades, the torches burn lower, and a chosen woman is led away, not to a private embrace, but to a chamber that has become something closer to an operating theatre. Behind these doors, Caligula abandoned the mask of convivial host. Here he was no longer performing for senators or priests. Here he conducted what can only be described as experiments in humiliation. Ancient sources speak of encounters that left women not merely violated, but transformed eyes, hollowed voices, broken their steps unsteady as they re-emerged into the public eye. The damage was not only physical. What set Caligula apart was the detachment with which he observed. He seemed less a lover than a physician of cruelty, watching for tremors, cataloguing tears, noting the exact moment when resistance collapsed into silence. This was not the excess of appetite. It was the vivisection of dignity. A man who had grown up among soldiers cheering violence, who had survived a household soaked in paranoia, who had trained under Tiberius's theatre of license, he now turned those lessons inward toward the most intimate fibres of Roman life. To him, sex was not an act of connection, but a scalpel cutting, probing, dismantling the very idea that a person's body or honour could be their own. We can recognise through modern eyes patterns of coercive control. Caligula isolated his victims, stripped them of privacy, forced them to participate in their own degradation. He made them complicit, a husband ordered to wait outside a wife forced to smile as she emerged, both knowing refusal was death. The emperor manipulated not only flesh but psychology, ensuring that shame itself would gag survivors more effectively than any guard. Victims left these chambers carrying an invisible order: say nothing, or your stance will be understood as gratitude. And what recourse did they have? None. Roman law, so intricate and proud in theory, dissolved before imperial will. A citizen could prosecute a neighbour for adultery, but not an emperor. The Senate could pass decrees, but never against the man whose nod could strip them of office or life. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, the emperor stood outside hierarchy, dominus et deus, in all but name. The imbalance was total. Dignity was no shield. Consent was meaningless. To be summoned was to be conquered. What mattered to Caligula was not the act itself, but the breaking point. He wanted to see how far a woman's pride could bend before it snapped, how much humiliation a family could absorb, before a father's eyes gave him away, how long silence could be maintained before it cracked into sobbing. His chamber was not a bedroom. It was a stage for psychological vivisection, an ongoing study of how to dismantle human beings without drawing blood. With every experiment, the line between desire and destruction blurred further until it vanished entirely. Lust no longer drove him. What excited him was the collapse of resistance, the moment when another person's dignity once proudly worn lay in fragments at his feet. For the emperor, that was the truest proof of power, not merely to possess a body, but to unmake a person, to strip them of their own sense of self, and to send them back into the world as living testimony that even Rome's noblest could be reduced to silence. In this, Caligula's reign advanced beyond ordinary vice. The emperors before him had mistresses, favourites, scandals whispered in porticos. But their excesses were personal. Caligula's were systemic. He made degradation a method of rule, humiliation a policy signal, cruelty a language the court was forced to learn. Behind closed doors, he did not simply indulge. He studied refined, perfected, and in doing so turned Rome's most private spaces into laboratories where dignity itself was dissected. Picture this: a palace banquet ends, the senators file out, and in the hush of the imperial wing, Caligula does not summon a stranger, but his sister. Drusilla, celebrated in Rome for her beauty, her Gresson the echoes of Germanicus's noble bloodline. She was adored by the people whispered of as the true jewel of the Julian house, and yet in the darkest corners of Roman rumour she was more than a sister, she was the emperor's consort. Here the historian's voice must tread carefully. Suetonius, eager for scandal, claims Caligula treated Drusilla as a wife, even sharing her bed openly during banquets. Cassius Dio echoes the charge, noting the shock such intimacies provoked, while Tacitus, more cautious, more sceptical, remains unsilent, leaving a gap as wide as the suspicion itself. Was it truth, or was it the sharpened weapon of libel wielded by senators, eager to paint the young emperor as a man who broke every law of gods and men? The evidence is murky, but whether literal or exaggerated, the persistence of the rumour reveals something undeniable. Caligula blurred the line between intimacy and politics so thoroughly that the very idea of incest could serve as shorthand for his rule. If we take Suetonius at his word, Drusilla was not only his obsession, but his experiment. Unlike the senators' wives who could be discarded, she was bound by blood, her love presumed unconditional. This gave him the perfect subject for testing how affection itself could be weaponized. To force a stranger to submit was one thing. To force a sister was to prove that even the most sacred bonds of family could be twisted into instruments of domination. In Rome, where pietas duty to family and gods was a civic virtue, such desecration struck at the very core of identity. And yet Caligula cloaked this in theology. He elevated his sisters, especially Drusilla, to divine status. Coins were minted showing her alongside goddesses' temples, whispered of her as a living divinity. To the people she was sacred. But behind closed doors that divinity was perverted into cover. If a goddess could be worshipped, why not possessed? If she embodied the empire's vitality, why not consume it in rituals disguised as intimacy? Caligula twisted the Julian tradition of divinization. Augustus made into a god after death into something grotesque, the living body of his sister adored in public, desecrated in private. Imagine the psychological theatre. Drusilla displayed at ceremonies as Rome's new Venus, garlanded and radiant while senators bowed. Later in chambers, stripped of witnesses, forced to enact humiliation that mocked the very honours she had just received. For Caligula, this contradiction was the point. It was a proof of his sovereignty that he could demand worship and degradation from the same body in the same day, and the world would accept both as policy. Whether or not every rumour is literal, the pattern is clear. Caligula transformed intimacy into leverage, love, into theatre family, into laboratory. To violate a stranger proved cruelty, to violate a sister proved omnipotence. Drusilla's role, whatever its precise truth, stands as the most haunting symbol of a reign in which no bond was sacred, no affection safe, and even love itself became a weapon sharpened by the hand of power. Picture the private wing of the Palatine Palace in AD 38. It is not a home in the Roman sense. No clear thresholds, no division of space between public and private. Caligula ordered the walls removed, the corridors fused. He and his three sisters, Drusilla Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, lived in an architecture of exposure. There were no doors, no chambers of retreat. It was as if the very house proclaimed his philosophy. Privacy was weakness, boundaries were illusions. Intimacy belonged to the emperor alone. To the Roman people, these women embodied hope. They were the daughters of Germanicus, heirs to his charisma, visible symbols of continuity after the long paranoia of Tiberius. Coins bore their images, inscriptions honoured them as goddesses. Caligula himself orchestrated new festivals in their names, the rituals blurred categories that Romans had once held sacred. In one moment, citizens were commanded to hail Agrippina as a divine figure. In the next, she was compelled to appear at ceremonies that veiled obscenity in sacred robes. Cultus principis, the worship of the imperial family, was no longer a political courtesy. It was colonizing the bodies of the emperor's own kin. Drusilla, the eldest, bore the heaviest burden of his obsession. Agrippina, sharper, learned to adapt. She bent rather than broke, playing along with her brother's demands while quietly calculating her own survival. She absorbed the lesson that intimacy could be currency, that submission could be performed, that proximity to a tyrant could be weaponized into power. This survival tactic, forged in Caligula's distorted household, would later shape her own rise, her marriage strategies, her alliance, building her ruthless tutelage of a son named Nero. Julia Livilla, the youngest, was less fortunate. Lacking Drusilla's mythic aura and Agrippina's shrewdness, she was left vulnerable. Ancient sources describe her as beautiful and artistic, but beauty in this context was no blessing. She became another pawn in Caligula's experiments, paraded as a goddess in daylight, degraded as property by night. For her there was no leverage, only opposure. The rites themselves grew increasingly grotesque. Caligula demanded that senators attend ceremonies where the sisters were exalted as divine, their bodies draped in gold and jewels. Yet the same audience everyone knew that these women were simultaneously captives in a house without doors, forced into a theatre of humiliation orchestrated by their own brother. The sacred and the obscene were fused not by accident but by design. Caligula understood that religion, the spine of Roman order, could sanctify even desecration if staged with enough pomp. This was the essence of cultus principis. Augustus had carefully allowed his image to be honoured, but always with restraint. Rome was not to appear enslaved. Under Caligula, the restraint snapped. Worship was not optional. It became daily policy, stamped on coins, carved into rituals, etched onto the very bodies of the emperor's sisters. The Roman people learned to bow not only before the gods of the capital, but before a family turned into spectacle, a family stripped of humanity in order to prove divinity. What unfolded in the family wing was not hidden vice. It was a state theatre, its scripts performed through architecture, religion, and flesh. The emperor's household was remade into a shrine of contradictions, sisters as goddesses, sisters as captives, sisters as victims, forced to embody the very theology that justified their violation. Agrippina, calculating, stored the lesson. If survival meant masking humiliation with divine aura, then power could one day be reclaimed in the same way. Julia Livilla remained unguarded, a warning of how swiftly beauty becomes vulnerability under tyranny. And Drusilla at the centre was both adored and consumed. The house without doors was more than Caligula's dwelling. It was a symbol of his reign, a Rome where boundaries no longer held, where the sacred and the obscene were indistinguishable, and where worship itself had become a policy enforced at the edge of a blade. Picture Rome in the summer of AD 38. The city that once hummed with celebration now murmurs with confusion and dread. Drusilla, Caligula's beloved sister, the woman he had elevated as goddess, suddenly lies dead, fever perhaps, or complications of childbirth. Whatever the cause, the emperor's reaction shook Rome more than her passing itself. Caligula collapsed into grief, but not the kind of grief Rome recognized. His mourning was not private but imperial policy. He decreed that the empire itself would grieve with him. Public festivals were cancelled, courts, silence markets shuttered. Senators were commanded to wear mourning garb. Citizens who failed to display visible sorrow risked accusations of impiety, even treason. It was not enough to acknowledge the death. One had to weep convincingly to embody grief as though the fate of one's family depended on it. This was not without precedent. Roman tradition had deified members of the imperial family before Augustus himself, after death had been declared a god. Livia, his widow, had been styled Diva Augusta. But those honours were bestowed after lifetimes of public service carefully staged to secure legitimacy. Caligula shattered that restraint. He declared Drusilla a goddess, immediately, not posthumously debated in the Senate, but by imperial fiat. Statues rose to her as Diva Drusilla, temples dedicated sacrifices demanded. Rome was ordered to adore her in death as it had in life, but now through the lens of her brother's obsession. The politics of mourning had become weaponized. To fail in grief was not a social misstep, it was treason. Senators wept in public, unsure if their tears were genuine or simply survival strategy. Priests offered incense with trembling hands. Households lit funeral lamps long after the body was buried, terrified that the smoke might fade too soon. Rome, accustomed to honouring the dead, now learned that grief itself could be measured, monitored, punished. But behind Caligula's decrees there lurked another truth. This was not only mourning, it was the loss of his primary victim. Drusilla had been central to his theatre of control, the body he had used to prove that even love, even family, could be broken and rebuilt as spectacle. Years of conditioning had bound her into his experiments. She was the axis on which his rituals of domination turned. Without her, the machinery faltered. He sought substitutes. Women who resembled her were summoned, forced into his chambers, commanded to reenact gestures, to echo expressions. But none of them carried the same weight. They had not been moulded by years of shared childhood, of cultivated dependence, of public adoration twinned with private desecration. They lacked the history that made humiliation meaningful. No substitute could reproduce the alchemy of power and intimacy that Drusilla's presence had provided. This failure only sharpened his desperation. The emperor did not merely lose a sister, he lost the mirror that reflected his power at its most grotesque. Her death tore a hole in his system of control, one that could never be patched. and so his grief twisted into something more dangerous, not sorrow for the lost but hunger for a void that could never again be filled. Rome saw temples rise to Drusilla as though she had been Venus reborn. But the empire also saw an emperor unmoored, groping for new instruments of domination and willing to drag the entire state deeper into ritualized obscenity to replace what had been taken from him. Drusilla's death was not simply the passing of a young woman, it was the collapse of the linchpin in Caligula's theatre of power. For the first time, the mask of control slipped, revealing that beneath the divine proclamations and sacred rites, the emperor's machinery depended on something fragile. The presence of one woman shaped into goddess and victim, whose absence would haunt both his reign and his sanity. Picture the Circus Maximus in AD 39. The largest theatre in the world, capable of swallowing more than 200,000 souls, is dressed in banners of crimson and gold. The people crowd the stone tiers, shouting gambling, eager for bread and spectacle. The smell of roasted meat mixes with the pungency of sweat horses and oil lamps burning under the colonnades. For centuries, Rome had been addicted to spectacle. The arena was not only entertainment, it was pedagogy, a school where the crowd learned what Rome valued: courage, endurance, the theatre of death turned into ritual. But on this day, the air feels different. The crowd waits not only for chariots and steel, but for something else, something unsettling they cannot name. In the emperor's box, Caligula leans forward with a smile that is both boyish and predatory. He has discovered a new curriculum for Rome's oldest classroom. The games begin with familiarity. Gladiators clash steel against steel, blood spattering the sand. The audience roars, trained over generations to equate cruelty with courage. Yet when the interludes arrive, Caligula introduces his innovation. Instead of stage mythological plays or animal hunts, captured wives and daughters of defeated leaders are driven into the arena. They are not dressed as heroines, but as prisoners, their hair loose, their bodies exposed for the gaze of thousands. At first, the crowd falls silent. A senator watching from the stands feels his blood turn to stone for among the women he recognizes, a household name, a daughter of noble lineage. Then Caligula gestures and the spectacle begins. The women are forced into degrading acts, their humiliation orchestrated as entertainment. Fathers, husbands, brothers in the audience cannot look away. To protest is death. To watch is agony. Caligula has arranged mirrors and polished bronze panels around the arena, not to magnify the women, but to capture the faces of their kin. He studies them from his box. Husbands forced to smile through tears, fathers clenching fists until blood seeps from the nails. The true performance is not on the sand, but in the stands. Caligula's experiment is clear to prove that family honour, the cornerstone of Roman society, can be pulverised in public while an empire applauds. This was no deviation from Roman culture, but its corruption. For centuries, spectacles had trained Romans to find pleasure in violence. Gladiators fought with valour, and their courage was admired even as they died. Criminals were executed, their punishment considered justice. But Caligula fused sports, sex and state policy into a single theatre. Where once the arena taught bravery, it now taught submission. Where once bloodshed sanctified law, now humiliation sanctified the emperor's power. Priestly sanction soon followed. Rome's religion was woven into every civic act, and Caligula understood the value of divine theatre. He commanded sacrifices before and after these spectacles, declaring them offerings to the gods. Priests were made to bless the degradation of noble women as if it were a sacred ritual. Humiliation was no longer just entertainment, it was liturgy. What had been obscene in private chambers now unfolded under the blessing of incense and hymn. This was pedagogy by horror. The Roman crowd, trained by centuries of spectacle, adjusted quickly. At first disturbed, then uneasy, then accustomed, they began to cheer again. Degradation became another form of theatre. Caligula was teaching them that what once seemed unthinkable could, with repetition and ceremony, become ordinary. The Circus Maximus, once a place to witness courage and martial virtue, had become an altar. Its sacrifices were not gladiators dying bravely, but families stripped of dignity. Its gods were not Jupiter or Mars, but the emperor himself smiling in his box, drinking in the sight of a civilization learning to confuse cruelty with worship. Rome had always believed the arena revealed character. Under Caligula, it revealed something else: how quickly a people can be trained to desire degradation when spectacle and sanctity join hands. Picture the empire in AD 39, a year after Drusilla's death. The Circus Maximus had already been transformed into a theatre of humiliation, but Caligula was not content with spectacle alone. He wanted refinement. Cruelty to him was not a crude impulse, but an art that demanded practice, precision, and apprentices. And so he built something Rome had never seen before: schools, not for gladiators but for torment. Ancient sources speak of training grounds where condemned criminals and captured enemies were drilled, not in swordplay, but in the mechanics of sexual degradation. Here, cruelty was rehearsed until it became choreography. Men and women were instructed on how to inflict shame rather than wounds, how to stage humiliation for maximum psychological effect. It was not random violence, it was discipline, a curriculum in desecration. The machinery required staff overseers, scribes, guards, instructors. Each role carried its own erosion of conscience. A scribe might begin by recording names and schedules, neat lists on wax tablets, logistics no different from provisioning the legions. A guard might escort a prisoner to a chamber telling himself he was only following orders. An instructor might demonstrate a ritual under the guise of service to the emperor. Piece by piece, the moral burden was broken into tasks so small that each participant could still imagine himself innocent. Paperwork gave it the illusion of order. Reports detailed which techniques produced the deepest terror, which left victims most compliant afterward, which combinations shattered dignity most efficiently. Tallies were kept as if the empire were measuring grain, not agony. Scribes filed accounts for the archives servants delivered. Progress to superiors and incentives, extra rations, higher pay. Promotion rewarded compliance. Cruelty was not simply allowed, it was managed, evaluated, rewarded. The subterranean chambers beneath the arenas became laboratories. There the emperor and his chosen staff observed what happened when human beings were stripped of context, privacy, and hope. Women dragged from the stands were forced into sessions that blurred the line between ritual punishment and experiment. Mirrors reflected their tears while attendants recorded every detail: how long resistance lasted, what broke it, what words made silence permanent. It was as if Rome's bureaucracy, so proud of its census rolls and tax ledgers, had been repurposed to catalogue the destruction of the human soul. Even the random cruelty was staged to seem systematic. At games, Caligula would gesture at the audience, selecting matrons at random to descend into the sand. These women, respectable, cloaked in dignity only moments before, were transformed into exhibits. Their families froze, knowing that protest meant annihilation. Once chosen, a matron disappeared beneath the arena into the chambers where instructors and guards awaited, armed with lessons polished in those schools of cruelty. When she returned, if she returned, she was altered, eyes downcast, lips sealed, a living advertisement of what could happen to anyone. Why did the staff comply? Why did no one break the chain? Because the system was designed to make refusal unthinkable. Each role was small, each decision dispersed, each man convinced he bore no final responsibility. Fear closed the rest. To say no to Caligula was to invite death not only for oneself, but for one's household. And so the empire's proud administrators and soldiers, men who once guarded the law, became custodians of degradation. This was how cruelty became normal. Not through one man's appetite alone, but through the machinery he built: schools that trained torment as skill, paperwork that disguised horror as duty, incentives that made obedience profitable, and chambers where the human body was dissected not with knives but with humiliation. In Rome's long history, the legions had trained men to fight and die for empire. Under Caligula, another kind of legion was forged, one trained to dismantle dignity piece by piece and to do it with the efficiency of clerks balancing accounts. Picture Rome at dusk. AD 39. The crowds spill from the Circus Maximus, shuffling home through narrow streets lined with taverns and shrines. At first they whisper in outrage about what they have just seen. Noblewomen dragged into the sand, matrons forced into roles no Roman mother should endure. Fathers shake their heads, mothers clutch their children tighter. Yet the following week they return, and the week after that they cheer. What began as shock is slowly settling into habit. This is how a city learns to look away. The ripple begins in the home. Marriage, once the bedrock of Roman society, erodes under silent dread. A husband cannot protect his wife. A father cannot safeguard his daughter. The emperor's gaze renders the family powerless. Honor dignitas, once defended at all costs, now becomes a liability, something that can be stripped in an instant. Husbands measure their worth not by protecting their households, but by how convincingly they can smile while their dignity is being stolen. Wives calculate their survival by their ability to emerge from the palace silent and intact. Parents, too, are hollowed. The Roman father, the pater familias, once held near absolute authority within the household. His role was to protect to guard the family's pudicitia, its modesty, its public virtue. Under Caligula, this authority collapses. A father can do nothing when his daughter is chosen from the stands. A mother cannot shield her son from being mocked in public rituals. The family, once Rome's most sacred institution, becomes porous, vulnerable to intrusion at any moment. The economy of honour collapses. In Rome, reputation was currency. Farmer public reputation was a man's greatest inheritance. It decided elections, marriages, alliances. But when the emperor can publicly mock a senator's wife, when he can violate daughters without consequence, farmer becomes meaningless. Reputation no longer protects. Instead, families learn to guard silence more fiercely than honour. To speak of humiliation risks drawing attention. Better to say nothing, pretend nothing happened, and hope the next summons falls on another household. The Senate reflects the same decay. Once the chamber of Rome's proudest men, it grows quiet, cowed by the whole knowledge that their families can be made examples at any time. Debate turns hollow. Laws are passed with nods, not arguments. Senators discover that to preserve their lives, they must sacrifice their household's dignity. Rome's ruling class becomes an audience forced to applaud its own destruction. Over time, the unthinkable becomes routine. At first, the games horrify mothers sobbing in the sand, men pale with shame. But repetition is powerful. Each month brings new spectacles, each more grotesque until the crowd no longer recoils. They adapt as humans do, folding horror into the fabric of everyday life. Children grow up assuming this is normal. Merchants joke about it in taverns. Priests sanctify it with ritual. The city that once gasped now yawns, trained to find entertainment in degradation. Here we see Caligula's most insidious genius. He rewrote Mos Maiorum, the ancestral customs that had guided Roman society for centuries. Mos Maiorum was more than tradition. It was the moral compass of the Republic, the weight of the ancestors shaping every decision. Courage in war, restraint in pleasure, dignity in public life, these were the virtues Rome claimed as its spine. By repetition, Caligula inverted them. Courage became complicity, restraint became silence, dignity became the ability to endure humiliation without protest. And the people weary of politics, eager for bread and spectacle, learned the new code. They adjusted their lives around the emperor's perversity. They laughed when commanded, cried when ordered, and pretended not to notice the corrosion spreading into their homes. Rome had been built on law and honour. Now it was governed by fear and repetition. A city does not collapse in a day. It learns to look away piece by piece, first in shock, then in silence, then in acceptance. Under Caligula, the world's proudest capital discovered how quickly ancestral values could be rewritten, until even the violation of its noblest families became another act in the endless theatre of empire. Picture the Palatine Palace in AD 40. Marble corridors echo with the footsteps of scribes, not lovers. The emperor has ordered a new wing constructed, not a harem in the Eastern sense of silken cushions and courtesans, but something colder, more deliberate, a place designed not for pleasure but for study. The architecture itself reveals the intention chambers interconnected with observation, galleries, walls, inset with polished bronze for reflection doors that never fully close. Luxury and surveillance fused into a single design. This was not about indulgence, it was about measurement. The women selected for this imperial harem were not chosen only for beauty. Caligula's agents scoured the empire for daughters of generals, wives of senators, relatives of equestrian magnates, even wealthy merchants' beloved children. Selection was political, genealogical, psychological. The point was not simply to degrade the woman herself, but to ripple humiliation outward through entire kin networks. By breaking one, he could poison dozens. Each name inscribed in the palace ledgers represented not only a body, but a web of relationships that could be unspooled into terror. The logistics were carefully managed. Scribes drew up lists. Clerks kept meticulous schedules as though maintaining a census of sorrow. Records tracked how long each woman endured, how quickly her spirit cracked, what words silenced her most effectively. It was bureaucracy turned inside out. The same precision that tallied taxes and legions was now applied to human despair. Wax tablets filled with notes that read less like poetry than like the observations of a natural philosopher. Resistance fades after 3 days without sleep. Shame magnified when husband is forced to watch. Silence sustained by promise of child safety. The architecture itself became part of the experiment. Rooms draped in silk beds, piled with cushions, meals of delicacies served on silver, all the trappings of privilege but twisted into instruments of harm. Luxury became the stage upon which degradation unfolded, forcing captives to wear jewels to fine foods to recline, as if honoured made the contrast with their suffering sharper. The palace taught them that even beauty could be corrupted, that even comfort could be weaponized. Surveillance was constant. Observation galleries allowed attendants to record without being seen. Mirrors reflected every tremor. Guards watched not only to prevent escape, but to track gestures of resistance or despair. Every sigh, every tear, every broken smile became data entered into ledgers, as if the emperor were compiling a manual on the dismantling of dignity. Family complicity was engineered as part of the system. Fathers were summoned to deliver daughters, husbands ordered to prepare wives, mothers forced to witness their children's humiliation. Each act was documented not only to measure pain, but to ensure that shame was diffused across entire households. No one remained untouched. Entire families carried the stain, and with it the certainty that they could never rebel without betraying their own. What emerges is not the portrait of an emperor lost in lust, but of one who had turned cruelty into research. The harem was not a brothel. It was a research institute of power, a living archive of degradation. The emperor was less participant than overseer, reading reports, summoning victims, comparing outcomes, refining methods. Pleasure, if it existed, was secondary. The true intoxication lay in control, in proving that even Rome's most sacred bonds marriage, kinship honour, could be catalogued, inverted and broken with the efficiency of a state office. This was the perverse genius of Caligula. He turned bureaucracy into an accomplice architecture, into a weapon luxury, into a trap. Rome's greatest house was no longer merely a palace. It had become an institute where the human spirit was tested, dismantled, and recorded, an empire's administrative machinery devoted to the science of breaking souls. Picture the gates of the Palatine opening at dawn. A litter is carried out veiled in silk, and within it sits a woman once radiant, now silent. She is not executed, not exiled, she is released. But what returns to her household is not the same person who was taken. This is Caligula's newest weapon survivors, sent back into the city not as victims to be pitied, but as instruments of contagion, carrying with them the corrosion of everything Rome held sacred. Families receive them with trembling hands. A father bows before his neighbours, pretending gratitude for the emperor's mercy, even as his daughter will not meet his eyes. A husband tries to resume the rhythms of domestic life, but the bed is cold with dread. Children learn quickly that questions are dangerous. Silence becomes the household's only inheritance. What Caligula perfected in his palace is now transplanted into Rome's very home, spreading like a poison. The trauma is not private, it becomes communal. A woman who has endured the palace experiments no longer trusts her kin no longer trust the city no longer trusts itself. Survivors forced to smile when summoned to public festivals embody the emperor's lesson. Resistance is futile, dignity is breakable, and silence is survival. Each released victim is a living reminder to her community of what the emperor can do, and therefore what must never be opposed. Compensation seals the cycle. Some families receive sudden gifts, land grants, positions, coin. To accept them is to bind the mouth. To reject them is to risk another summons. Silence becomes contract. A father who swore he would speak finds himself building a new villa with imperial funds, knowing that its walls are mortared with his daughter's humiliation. In Rome, wealth was often proof of favour. Now it is proof of complicity. Religious language launders the violence. Caligula commands priests to frame these survivals as blessings, tokens of divine will. Survivors are presented at festivals dedicated to Isis or Serapis, clothed in white, crowned with garlands, as though their endurance were proof of sacred communion. The emperor himself is hailed as Numen, a living divinity whose touch, however cruel, transforms. To question is not only treason, but impiety. What was degradation in private becomes sanctified in public, wrapped in incense, smoke, and hymn. The cult of the emperor feeds on this inversion. Augustus had been worshipped in carefully staged temples, his divinity a matter of statecraft. Caligula twists that tradition, demanding that humiliation itself be seen as proof of divine power. To suffer at his hand is to be chosen, to be broken is to be sanctified, and the priests dependent on imperial favour repeat the lie until it echoes through Rome's streets. In this way, survivors do not return as they left. They are remade into instruments of compliance, carrying the emperor's gospel of fear into every forum and household. Communities fracture under the weight of unspoken knowledge. Families learn to mask shame with gratitude. Neighbours learn not to us, and Rome itself learns a darker liturgy that pain, when branded by power, can be mistaken for blessing. Thus the contagion spreads not by sword or fire, but by silence, wealth, and ritual. Caligula does not need to patrol every home. He has discovered a more efficient weapon, turning survivors into emissaries of fear. Their very presence a reminder that the emperor's reach is endless, his cruelty divine, and that even the return of a loved one may be the most devastating blow of all. Picture the Palatine Palace in the winter of AD 41. The marble halls that once echoed with ritual greetings now vibrate with sounds that servants no longer recognize as human. Laughter dissolves into shrieks, sobs mingle with hymns, and sometimes in the dead of night, voices carry from the imperial chambers that seem neither male nor female, neither joy nor grief, something unmoored. Guards posted outside admit to clutching their spears tighter when those noises rise, as if the emperor's presence itself could spill beyond walls. The staff moves like ghosts. Men who once bustled confidently through corridors now avoid each other's eyes, speaking only in whispers. Slaves flinch at sudden sounds, some trembling uncontrollably, others staring blankly as if detached from their own bodies. We would call it trauma today, symptoms of sleeplessness, dissociation, the inability to feel safe even in daylight. But in Rome it had no name. It was simply the air of the palace, the atmosphere one inhaled with each breath of incense and sweat. The Senate too is paralyzed. Its members file into meetings, but speak in shallow voices, offering only what they know the emperor wants to hear. Once proud men guardians of law and custom now live in terror that a careless gesture or an insufficient tear at a ritual will doom their households. Debate is gone, replaced by silence, applause on command, and desperate attempts to fade into anonymity. The very institution meant to guide the empire has become an audience waiting each day for the next performance of cruelty. The priests fare no better. Rome's temples, once the guardians of continuity, now recite liturgies twisted by imperial decree. Sacrifices to honour Drusilla as a goddess continue, though everyone knows the rituals mask a deeper desecration. Incense clouds rise over altars where prayers are whispered for survival rather than devotion. The sacred is corrupted, and those who officiate it do so with trembling hands, caught between duty to gods and obedience to an emperor who insists he himself is divine. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, are uneasy. They are men of discipline trained to fear little. Yet in the palace they hear the screams, they see the survivors emerge broken, they are ordered to participate in duties that corrode the soul. Loyalty remains outwardly intact, but among themselves they mutter. They glance at each other with haunted eyes, sensing that their role has shifted from guardians of the throne to accomplices in something unspeakable. Some begin to wonder what happens when the monster turns his gaze on the very men sworn to protect him. Beyond the palace, pressure mounts. Rome's coffers strain under the weight of spectacles and largesse. The games, the temples, the construction of his engineered harem all drain the treasury. Tax collectors press the provinces harder, igniting resentment. In Judea, Caligula orders his statue placed inside the temple at Jerusalem, a command so incendiary that it nearly sparks rebellion. Philo and Josephus record the panic of a people faced with desecration of their holiest site, a crisis only barely averted when cooler heads stalled the decree. Elsewhere in Gaul and along the Rhine, mutters of discontent ripple through legions stretched thin, their loyalty tested by erratic imperial whims. Rome itself becomes a city of nightmares. Citizens walk the forum with wary eyes, never knowing when a gesture of insufficient reverence might be reported. Families avoid speaking of what happens in the palace, though everyone knows. Even the soundscape of the capital changes, fewer open songs at taverns, more furtive silences, more hurried footsteps at dusk, fewer conversations lingering in colonnades. The empire's heart still beats, but it beats unevenly, as though stricken by fever. By AD 41, the imperial palace is no longer simply the seat of government. It is the engine of fear radiating outwards until Senate, priesthood, guard, and common people are bound in the same nightmare. Caligula has succeeded not only in breaking individuals, but in remaking an entire ecosystem, a society that breathes terror as naturally as air, that bows by instinct, and that no longer knows where the performance ends and reality begins. But nightmares, however long they last, have a limit. The palace is saturated with dread, the city stretched thin with silence, the empire groaning under crises. What Caligula cannot see in his chamber lit by torchlighted and haunted voices is that every scream has planted a seed of rage, every humiliation a hunger for revenge. Rome is learning to endure, but it is also learning to prepare. Picture January 41 AD. The palace is swollen with dread, the city bent beneath silence. Yet beneath that silence something hardens. The conspirators who will soon raise daggers against Caligula are not men of ideology or lofty political theory. They are men who cannot bear one more day of complicity. At the centre stands Cassius Dio, a praetorian tribune whose name Rome once associated with discipline and service. Caligula mocked him cruelly, taunting his masculinity, forcing him to give obscene watchwords to the guard, turning a soldier's honour into a punchline. But Cairea's rage was not born of insult alone. He had seen what the palace had done. He had led men through corridors where screams leaked beneath doors, watched noble women reduced to shells being forced to serve as custodian for rituals that stripped Rome's values bare. Each command obeyed left another wound inside him. The weight of complicity became unbearable. His only path to reclaim honour was to destroy the source. Others gathered praetorians, senators, equestrians, each carrying their own ledger of shame. A senator who had smiled while his wife was taken. A guard who had escorted children to chambers he dared not name. A priest who had blessed rituals he knew were desecrations. None of them could undo what had been done, but together they could end the hand that forced them to participate. This was not revolution. It was revenge distilled into steel. When the moment came January 24th during a festival of theatre, the violence was not clean. Suetonius and Cassius Dio tell us Caligula was struck with 30 wounds, far more than necessary. Each blade, each thrust was catharsis. It was the eruption of years of humiliation and rage, a collective exorcism of the pain they had been forced to inflict and endure. The emperor did not die quickly. He died as his victims had lived, surrounded, scrutinized, torn apart piece by piece. But killing the emperor was not enough. The conspirators turned next to his apparatus. Records were ripped from archives, wax tablets smashed, scrolls burned. The ledgers of cruelty, the notes that catalogued experiments, humiliation schedules, and victim responses were destroyed. They knew what those records contained, evidence too vile to let survive proof that the empire's bureaucracy had been turned into a laboratory of degradation. To leave them intact would mean Rome itself might never escape the stain. Enthusiastic functionaries too were executed. Not the frightened clerks who had copied lists with trembling hands, but the zealots, the ones who had enjoyed their duties, who had innovated cruelties to please the emperor. They were not just guilty, they were dangerous. To let them live would be to preserve the habits of tyranny. Their deaths were not only punishment, but purgation, a cleansing of the palace. The conspiracy was not built on lofty speeches or dreams of restoring liberty. It was built on the unbearable knowledge of what they had done in silence. Men who could not forgive themselves sought at least to balance the scales with blood. In that sense, Caligula's murder was not simply a political assassination, it was a ritual of release. The 30 wounds were a ledger closed, each thrust a line drawn under an account too heavy to carry. And yet even as the emperor's blood stained the marble, Rome was left with a question. How does the society live with its complicity once the tyrant is gone? The conspirators had destroyed the man, the records, and the willing executioners. But the memory of participation, the knowledge that thousands had looked away, obeyed, survived, could not be erased with fire or steel. That burden remained echoing in every silence the city had learned to master. The trauma that had broken Rome had in the end turned to steel in a handful of men, and with their daggers they ended the nightmare. But steel cannot heal, it can only cut. Picture the aftermath, January 41 AD. The emperor lies dead in a corridor, his blood soaking into marble grooves that slaves will scrub for days. But the real stain is not on stone, it is on Rome itself. The conspirators disperse, and in the stunned silence that follows, the Senate hesitates. Who inherits an empire so drenched in dread? The answer arrives almost accidentally. Claudius Caligula's uncle, timid, bookish thought, a fool is discovered, trembling behind a curtain. The Praetorian Guard, craving stability, proclaim him emperor. Rome's nightmare is over, but the work of repair has barely begun. Claudius inherits not only a throne but a people fractured. His first acts are not bold reforms but triage. He restores the banquets and festivals, but this time with boundaries, games that celebrate courage, not humiliation. Spectacles where honour is displayed rather than shredded. He offers compensation to families broken under Caligula, gifts of money and status, meant not as bribes but as bandages. Survivors are honoured publicly, not degraded, their silence permitted rather than enforced. Even small gestures reintroducing mourning rites according to the custom, reaffirming the sanctity of temples, carry enormous weight. Rome, desperate for ritual order, breathes again. The restoration of boundaries is crucial. Claudius understands that Roman life depends on mos maiorum, the ancestral customs Caligula had mocked. Marriage once hollowed by fear is honoured again in law. Priests humiliated under forced blasphemies are reinstalled with dignity. Senators are invited back to debate their words once more carrying meaning. It is not perfect, Claudius remains cautious, aware that power's shadow never disappears. But even cautious restoration feels like rebirth after years of nightmare. Yet history itself becomes part of the triage. How do you tell the story of a reign so obscene that even survivors cannot speak it? Ancient writers wrestle with the problem. Suetonius revels in scandal, recording every lurid rumour, incest, torture, divine pretensions, because exaggeration captures the truth of atmosphere, if not always of fact. Cassius Dio, writing later, smooths the horror into moral lesson, blaming corruption of the system as much as the man. Tacitus, more restrained, leaves gaps, his silence heavy with implication. Each historian shapes the memory not only to describe but to manage it. Politics drives this too. The Senate, humiliated by its complicity, exaggerates Caligula's madness to disguise its own paralysis. Better to call him a monster beyond reason than admit they applauded his humiliations. Later emperors, needing legitimacy, highlight his crimes to make their own reigns appear stable and just. Memory itself becomes policy. The truth, fragmented, unbearable, is reshaped into narrative. Rome even attempts the ritual of damnatio memoriae, erasing Caligula's name from inscriptions, toppling his statues, chiselling his titles from stone. Officially, he is condemned to oblivion. But oblivion never holds. Too many had witnessed, too many had whispered. His story survives in fragments of scrolls and gossip that crosses generations, in historians who sift rumour for meaning. In trying to forget, Rome ensured he would be remembered forever. Claudius, for his part, tries not to dwell on his nephew's shadow. His reign is practical administrative, defined by the building aqueducts, expanding bureaucracy, securing provinces. But beneath each decree lies an unspoken purpose to restore Rome's faith that power could govern without desecration. Where Caligula had blurred sacred and profane, Claudius labours to reseparate them, to prove that law and ritual can again hold firm. And yet some wounds resist repair. Families remain scarred. Survivors of the palace experiments carry silence like a second skin. The guard, complicit in horror, carry guilt they cannot name. The Senate, though restored, never fully regains its dignity. Trauma lingers in memory, unspoken but alive. So when we read Caligula's story in the pens of later historians, we must ask, are we reading the monster or the scar tissue of those who lived beneath him? Memory magnifies, distorts, conceals. But the fact of trauma remains. Claudius could rebuild aqueducts, temples, laws. What he could not fully repair was the soul of Rome. The empire had survived the monster. But survival is not the same as wholeness. Picture yourself walking today through the long hollow of the Circus Maximus. The grass grows where sand once ran red. The hum of scooters replaces the roar of crowds, but the shape of the stone still remembers. Here 200,000 voices once rose as one. Here Caligula taught a civilization to clap for humiliation. Here dignity itself was made a spectacle wrapped in ritual, sold as worship. The stones do not speak in words but in echoes. If you stand still, you can almost hear it, the cheers, the cries, the silence of men forced to smile as their households were stripped of honour. History lingers in the air of ruins not as legend, but as warning. What the reign of Caligula reveals is not only the depravity of one man, it reveals the pattern by which cruelty becomes system. First, a child learns violence as play, then a court learns silence as survival, then a people learn to applaud what once horrified them. Institutions among a Senate priesthood guard become accomplices not by sudden collapse, but by gradual erosion. Bureaucracy gives cruelty structure, ritual gives it sanctity, spectacle gives it applause. In the end, what should have remained unthinkable becomes routine, and that pattern is not ancient alone. Modern eyes recognize it too well. We know what it means when private suffering becomes institutional, when secrecy and shame silence survivors, when crowds learn to look away, when priests or officials lend to sacred cover to acts that desecrate. The methods shift, the costumes change, but the grammar of abuse remains chillingly familiar. Yet history also offers a harder truth, one that resists despair. Systems of cruelty do not endure forever. Trauma may paralyze, but it also breeds resistance. In Caligula's Rome, the very weight of complicity forged steel in a handful of men who finally struck him down. It was not ideology that ended the nightmare, but the unbearable human need to stop being instruments of harm. Human dignity, though it can be scarred, does not vanish. It waits buried but unbroken until the moment comes to rise. The ruins of the Circus Maximus are quiet now. Tourists stroll where senators once quailed, where noble women once wept, where priests once lied. The stones bear no inscriptions of what happened. And yet in their silence they ask us a question. When cruelty dresses itself in spectacle, when institutions become accomplices, when silence is easier than courage, what will we do? Will we look away as Rome once did? Or will we remember that even in the darkest corridors of power, history belongs to those who refuse to applaud the stones remember? The question is whether we will. History often confronts us with images that feel too grotesque to belong to the human story. Caligula's Rome is one of those images, a world where cruelty became policy, where intimacy was weaponized, where religion and ritual sanctified what should have been unthinkable. Yet to dismiss it as the madness of one emperor is to miss the deeper lesson. What mattered was not only Caligula's appetites, but the system that allowed them to spread, how institutions bent, how silence calcified, and how a city learned to look away until degradation became routine. There are lessons here that reach far beyond the stones of the Circus Maximus. The first is that cruelty rarely appears in its full form at once. It begins with small erosions, one boundary blurred, one somnolence kept, one compromise made for survival. Roman senators told themselves that enduring an insult was safer than speaking. Priests convinced themselves that blessing a corrupted ritual was still service to the gods. Citizens returned to the arena week after week, slowly teaching themselves to applaud what had horrified them before. In our own lives, whether in families, workplaces, or societies, we face the same temptation to accept small injustices for the sake of convenience or safety. History reminds us that silence is not neutral, it is a seedbed for cruelty. The second lesson is that institutions can either protect dignity or magnify abuse. Rome's greatest strengths, its bureaucracy, its priesthood, its arenas, became the emperor's tools of control. What had once organized armies and irrigated fields now organized humiliation. The structures themselves were not evil, but once bent they gave cruelty scale and permanence. Today we rely on our own systems, schools, laws, companies, communities to hold firm against misuse. Their strength depends not only on rules, but on the courage of those within them to resist when those rules are twisted. The third lesson is that trauma lingers long after tyrants fall. Claudius could rebuild aqueducts, restore ritual and compensate victims, but he could not erase the scars left on households forced into silence. Survivors carried their pain in secret, passing it down like an invisible inheritance. This is as true in modern times as it was in Rome. When harm is ignored, when victims are silenced, the wound does not vanish, it ripples through generations. To repair, we must not only punish the guilty, but also honour the broken, creating spaces where truth can be spoken without fear. And finally, there is hope hidden in the darkest places. Caligula's reign ended not because of ideology or revolution, but because ordinary men could no longer bear their own complicity. Trauma unbearable as it was hardened into resolve. Even in systems designed to crush resistance, the human need for dignity found a way to strike back. That lesson is sobering, but empowering. Cruelty may be vast, but it is never absolute. So when we stand among the ruins, the question the stones whisper is not only about the past, but about us. When we see silence creeping, when spectacle disguises injustice, when institutions bend toward harm, will we look away, or will we remember Rome's warning? History gives us its answer. What we allow becomes what we are. What we resist becomes what we leave behind. Thank you, subscribe now, and don't miss what's to come.